This is Audible.
Silly Stories About Vegetables, Books 1 to 3, written by Paul Cook and narrated by Paul Cook. Copyright 2018 by Paul Cook. A stick of rhubarb. A stick of rhubarb is a lovely thing, especially with custard or in a crumble. One day, a stick of rhubarb decided to take a walk down a lane for no other reason than perhaps a stick of rhubarb had never gone for a walk down a lane before. This particular rhubarb was bright purple, as most sticks of rhubarb are. It was thin, slightly bent, and had a big sprig of green leaves sprouting from its head. The cows in the field by the lane just stood still and looked at the rhubarb as though it was bonkers as it hopped by. Bonk, bonk, bonk. The rhubarb kept on hopping until it suddenly slipped over in a sloppy pile of mucky sludge. Splat! The rhubarb was covered in muck from head to toe. It just lay there on the lane, and a baby rabbit popped up out of a hole and took a crunchy bite out of the rhubarb's leaves. Munch. The rhubarb jumped back up again, and the rabbit hopped back down the hole quicker than a mouse being chased by a squashed tomato. Halfway down the lane, the rhubarb came across a cattle grid. It couldn't get over the cattle grid because it knew that no matter how hard it tried, it would probably slip between the bars and end up in the puddle of dirty water below with a big sloppy splosh. A drain was nearby, and the rhubarb listened to the water at the bottom of it gurgling like a busted-up old washing machine. Then suddenly, a fat, wobbly, hard-boiled egg rolled out of the hedge and plopped into the ditch. The egg, who was called Egg, crawled out of the ditch, stopped and looked at the rhubarb, who in turn stared back and rolled up to the cattle grid. It decided it couldn't get over, and so it wobbled back into the hedge. The rhubarb thought how rude the egg had been not to stop and chat, but then, suddenly, the egg slipped out of the hedge on the other side of the cattle grid. It stared at the rhubarb and said, "Squibble blodge a bleesh blonk blog squodge plop." The rhubarb agreed with what the egg had said. Almost immediately, a big jeep drove by and squished the egg. Blursh, splat! The rhubarb thought what a lovely egg had been, and what a poor egg he was for being squished into a gooey splodge. After that, the rhubarb headed on back to the vegetable patch where he had always been while he was growing up in the soil, and had a sleep. A dog chasing a duck woke the rhubarb up the next morning as it crashed into a bucket full of purple paint. The paint went everywhere, and the farmer chased the dog away, shouting loudly and waving angrily with his paintbrush. The dog left a trail of purple paw prints on the farmyard as it scampered away into the field. Later that morning, the rhubarb chatted with a couple of radishes, and was then picked from the ground by the farmer in the afternoon. Nobody has heard of the rhubarb since. Then, somewhere in a barn nearby, a pig did a big poo. Oh well, the end. A big red radish is a crunchy thing, especially with some salt and a couple of spring onions. In a vegetable patch in someone's back garden in a village near here last Thursday morning, a big red radish suddenly jumped out of the soil and started rolling around the side of the house, down the drive and into the lane. None of the other vegetables could think why a radish would do such a thing, except for perhaps, well, it just wanted to do it. This particular radish was bright red, as most bulbs of radish are, round, with a short root sticking out at the bottom, with a sprig of green leaves sprouting from the top. The daisies growing in the garden beside the house looked at the radish as though it was crazy as it rolled and bounced on by. Boink, boing, bonk. The radish kept on going until it rolled into a dirty, muddy puddle. Splosh! The radish was soaked in dirty water from top to bottom. It just lay there on the pavement, and a baby dormouse darted out of the hedge and started chewing on the radish's leaves. Nibble, nibble. The radish started rolling and bouncing again, so the dormouse hopped back through the hedge quicker than a badger being chased by a pickled onion wearing sunglasses. Down the road into town rolled the radish, bouncing on and off the pavement as it went. Some kids were racing their scooters up and down the high street, and the radish found that it had bounced onto one of them. The scooter was blue with 2 wheels and ridden by a young boy called Tom. A little sausage dog spotted the radish riding on the back of the scooter and started barking at it. A lawnmower was going nearby, and the radish listened to the engine revving, which sounded like an old hairdryer with a duck attached to it. Then suddenly an old man stepped out in front of Tom's scooter, and he swerved to miss him. The radish went flying through the air and landed with a big splash into a cup of coffee being drunk by a lady sat at a table at a cafe on the street. Plop! The lady was wearing a white frock, and the coffee splashed over her as the radish landed in her cup, leaving the big brown stain on her dress. She shrieked and immediately started mopping up the spilled coffee off the table and tried to wipe down her dress. Her shrieking increased when she spotted a bright red radish floating in her coffee cup with green leaves sprouting out of it. She picked up her coffee cup and threw the remaining coffee with the radish floating in it over the cobbled pavement. The radish rolled and bounced along the high street, leaving a trail of coffee behind it. Passers-by stared down in astonishment at the little radish rolling along the street and took great care not to step on it. The wind blew the radish this way and that, past shops, pubs, the library and the village hall. Suddenly a gust of wind blew the radish through an open door and into the greengrocer's shop. The radish rolled through the shop and came to stop against a sack of turnips. The grocer stooped down to pick the radish up and placed it onto one of the stalls in the shop amongst lots of other radishes. A little later on that morning, an elderly gentleman came into the greengrocer's to do his weekly shop. He picked up some tomatoes, a lettuce, 2 onions, and some radishes, including our radish. The grocer bagged everything, put it through the till, and the elderly gentleman left the shop with our radish in a brown paper bag, with the other radishes, the lettuce, the 2 onions, and the tomatoes. All of the vegetables chatted on the way home, and at lunchtime was served up at a buffet for the elderly gentleman, his wife, and their 3 grandchildren. Our radish was eaten by the elderly gentleman with a little salt and a sausage roll. Then, somewhere at a bus stop nearby, a girl sneezed loudly and dropped her bag of crisps in a puddle. Never mind. The end. The meadow mushrooms. A meadow mushroom is a tasty thing, especially when fried in garlic and butter and served on toasted bread. Once, in a clearing, which some might have called a meadow, there were 3 mushrooms. They did not know how they had got there, or why they grew in the shade of the trees beside the stream, but they grew there anyway. These were meadow mushrooms, and they had no names and did not know how old they were. They were creamy white in colour, as many mushrooms are, with a stalk and a cap. The underside of their caps, which looked like little umbrellas, were dark brown. All 3 mushrooms had magical powers, and because of this, they knew what the other was thinking. There they would sit in the clearing and just share their thoughts with one another. One particular morning, the first mushroom was thinking about a big fat goose with a toilet seat in its beak. Every time the goose wanted to say something, eat, or use its beak for anything, it would put the toilet seat on the ground and sit on it. What a silly goose! The second mushroom imagined a bright green hippo walking to school wearing slippers. He couldn't speak the language that the other children spoke, as he only knew how to speak hippo. When the teacher spoke to him, the only thing he could say was pthwumph. How the children used to laugh! The hippo laughed too, but not the teacher. When the teacher called the register and all the children answered when their name was called saying, "Here," the hippo would just say, "Pthwumph." The teacher would get very cross and send the hippo home. In the end, the hippo stopped going to school and just wallowed in the mud beside his house. The mushrooms listened to the water in the nearby stream, bobbing and plopping like a rusty toilet pipe with a hole in it. The third mushroom was thinking about a piglet who slobbered over everyone it met. The piglet came into the clearing and everything turned bright blue. The piglet walked over to the mushrooms and slobbered all over them. Ugh! The mushrooms were covered in a gooey slobber. Yeesh! Luckily, the piglet left, and soon afterwards it started to rain and the slobber was washed away. One morning in May, some children came with their teacher on a nature trail and picked the mushrooms. No one has seen or heard of them since. Then, somewhere in a stream nearby, a little frog leapt off a stone into the water. He slipped and bumped his lip. There we are then. The end. A sprig of parsley. A sprig of parsley is a tasty thing, especially when served on top of a cottage pie. Once, a sprig of parsley wanted to be a seagull instead of being just a boring sprig of parsley. As it grew in the soil, it thought what a lovely life it could have if it could only change into a seagull. It had seen seagulls from where it was planted and thought that they always looked so happy flying high up in the sky. This particular parsley was green, as most sprigs of parsley are. The stalk was light green, but the leaves were dark green. The main stalk split into two, and each stalk had many small leaves sprouting from the top of them. One sunny morning, the sprig of parsley who wanted to be a seagull was pulled from the soil in which it was growing at a farm somewhere near here. The soil was shaken from the roots of the parsley, and then it was sprayed with water and put into a large sack. The sack was filled with other sprigs of parsley, and then loaded onto a lorry. The pigs in the field by the road just stood still and looked at the lorry full of parsley as it trundled on by, clank, creak, clunk. After a while, the lorry stopped, and the back of it was opened up. The sacks were taken into a factory and emptied into a very large container. Several people wearing gloves stood beside the container sorting the parsley into batches and placed them onto a moving conveyor belt. Some of the parsley, including our sprig, didn't make it into the container, but instead was spilled onto the floor where the sacks were emptied. A tiny microbe, called Mike, spoke to the parsley and told it that this factory was made for chopping up parsley and sending it to supermarkets in plastic packets. The parsley decided that it didn't want to be put on a conveyor belt to get chopped up and sent off to a supermarket in a plastic packet, so it began to run towards the main door of the factory. A gust of wind swept the parsley into the air as soon as it left the building, and it blew across the car park and landed on a dirty drain cover. The parsley just lay there on the drain cover for a few moments until a seagull swooped down and flew off with it in its beak. The seagull flew out to sea carrying the sprig of parsley. The sprig wriggled free from the seagull's beak quicker than a wiggly worm with a runny nose falling off a toilet seat. As the parsley fell from the seagull, it felt happy, and it enjoyed falling through the air towards the sea below. The parsley hit the sea's surface with a dull plop and floated on the cool seawater in the heat of the sun. A fishing boat was sailing nearby, and the sprig of parsley listened to the men on board singing songs with voices that sounded like logs being chopped up with rusty old saws. Then, suddenly, the parsley found itself among a huge floating carpet of seaweed. The seaweed smelled of the sea, and was a darker green than the parsley, and was much larger. The parsley thought that it could happily spend the rest of its life just floating in the sun on the sea. Then the parsley found that a little wooden fishing boat had bobbed up beside it. A fisherman leant over and scooped the parsley out of the sea with his hand and spread it out on the side of the boat to dry in the sun. There the sprig of parsley lay for a while, enjoying the warmth of the sun on its leaves and the wood on which it was placed. The fisherman put on his radio and listened to the news while he buttered some bread and cut some slices of cheese. A little pot of pickle was on a table in the middle of the deck, and the parsley suddenly realized that the fisherman was making a sandwich. "Oh no," thought the parsley, because it didn't want to be eaten in a sandwich, but instead just to float on the sea for ever and ever. What a lovely cheese and pickle sandwich the fisherman had prepared for his lunch. He picked up the parsley and placed it carefully on top of his sandwich, took a knife to slice it in half. He picked up the parsley and placed it carefully on top of his sandwich, and picked up a knife to slice it in half. He suddenly stopped, picked up the parsley and looked at it closely. "Yuck," he said. "I thought this was seaweed." He tossed the parsley back into the sea and scooped up some seaweed and placed it on the side of the boat to dry so it could go on his sandwich. The parsley was so happy to be back in the sea after the narrow escape from the fisherman and just floated in the sun. Later that afternoon, the sprig of parsley chatted with a couple of fish and was last seen floating out to sea. Nobody has heard of the parsley since. Maybe it is still out there floating somewhere on the sea in the sun. Then, somewhere in a field near the coast, a cow tripped over a daisy and landed with a thud and a crash as it fell onto a pile of rusty old buckets. Oh dear. The end. A carrot. A big orange carrot is a wonderful thing, especially when chopped up and put into a beef stew. Once there was a little boy called Matthew, who lived in a house with his parents somewhere in a town nearby. It had snowed all through the night, and in the morning Matthew could hardly eat his breakfast fast enough so that he could get out into the garden and play. Matthew was so excited that he had brushed his hair with his toothbrush and brushed his teeth with his hairbrush. He had put his jumper on back to front and got his scarf tangled in the zip of his coat. Matthew, his mummy and daddy played in the snow for a while, and then they started to build a snowman. They rolled a large ball of snow for the body of the snowman and then made a smaller one and put it on the top as the head. Matthew's daddy dug out some pebbles, and Matthew placed them on the snowman as buttons for the coat, and the last two he used as eyes. Matthew's mummy took off her scarf and placed it around the snowman's neck. The snowman looked really good, but Matthew felt like something was still missing. He went back into the house, and his mummy and daddy just stood there in the garden, wondering what idea Matthew had just had. Matthew ran back out of the house, waving a carrot in his hand that he had found in the kitchen. Matthew's daddy knew what the carrot was for and pushed it into the snowman's head. Suddenly the snowman had a long, pointed nose, and the family clapped with happiness that their task was finished. Matthew named the snowman Jack, and then went back into the house with his mummy and daddy to drink some hot chocolate beside the fire. This particular carrot was long, wrinkly, and orange, as most carrots are. It was a little bit muddy, slightly bent, and had a sprig of green leaves sprouting from its head. The robin that was perched on a little branch of a nearby bush just stared at the carrot as it stuck out of the snowman's head like the wrinkly long nose of an old witch. After a while, the robin flew over to the snowman and perched on the carrot. The robin was very light, but it kept shifting from one leg to the other, and its toes tickled the carrot. The snowman started to laugh, and then it began the beginning of a big, huge, sloppy sneeze. Here it comes. Achoo! And with that, the carrot flew through the air, through the falling snow, and landed on a drain cover. The carrot rocked on the grid of the cover, and suddenly the wind blew it over, down between the gap and into the drain below. Plop! It was dark at the bottom of the drain, and the water was cold and very smelly. Yuck, thought the carrot. It's like being at the bottom of someone's stinky toilet. The water carried the carrot along through some pipes until it came into a large underground chamber. The chamber was lit, and there were lots of pipes flowing sludgy water into it. The carrot watched some rats dancing and singing a very silly song about giraffes on a platform on the other side of the chamber. They all wore bright blue trousers, sparkly silver tops, and red top hats. Suddenly a man entered the chamber dressed in a dark blue uniform and a hat. The rats stopped their singing and scurried away to hide. A large panel of dials and switches lit up, and the man pulled one of the big red levers beside it. A very loud gushing sound could suddenly be heard, and a big gap opened up in the back wall of the chamber. Our carrot was carried along by the current of the water at a very fast speed. It could do nothing except just go along with the swirling water that was being released through the widening gap in the wall. "Oh no," the carrot thought. "I am going to be swept away into a big, cold river and never be seen or heard of again." As the carrot neared the gap, it could see the swirling waters of a large river below. When the carrot was carried over the edge, it hit something and stopped moving. It seemed to be lodged in a grate or grid of some sort, and stayed there until the water had stopped gushing out of the chamber over it. There on the grid the carrot lay for some time, and the gap in the wall began to close. Then the carrot was being prodded and poked by a stick. The man in uniform had spotted the carrot and was trying to reach it with his pole. Eventually, the man managed to reach the carrot and put it in his pocket. He took it home and ate it for his supper with some sausages and mushy peas. Then, in the kitchen of a house nearby, a cat jumped up onto the top of a cupboard and knocked over an open carton of milk. The milk went everywhere, and the carton smacked a dog that was sleeping on the floor below right on the edge of his nose. Bonk! What a shame. The end. A turnip. A ripe, crunchy turnip is a lovely thing, especially when served up with roast potatoes, broad beans, turkey and gravy. One day, during harvest time, a farmer was digging up all of the turnips that he had been growing to sell to the local grocers. The farm was on top of the hill, and there was a very large field full of turnips to be dug up. It would take the farmer all day to dig up all of the turnips, even with the help of his large green tractor. At the bottom of the field, in the corner furthest from the farm, there was a little turnip who decided that it didn't want to be dug up, put in a sack, loaded into a trailer on the back of a tractor, and taken to the village to be sold. The turnip tried to get out of the soil in which it was planted, but it wasn't strong enough because almost all of it was under the ground. The farmer had been digging up turnips all morning, and the little turnip was beginning to think that it would never be dug up, but would instead stay under the ground forever. The farmer had sent his lads out to dig up the turnips in the corners of the field, around the edges where the tractor could not reach. One young lad bent down to pick up the turnip. It immediately wriggled free when it was pulled from the ground. The boy dropped the turnip in astonishment, and it quickly rolled into the ditch that ran along the length of the bottom field. The lad stood and looked at the ditch, shrugged his shoulders, and began to dig up the next turnip. This particular turnip was bright purple and white, as most turnips are. It was round and had a big sprig of green leaves sprouting from its head. Meanwhile, in the ditch, the turnip waited until the farmer's lad had dug up all of the turnips and gone for his lunch. A slimy green little frog was in the ditch, and it started to lick the turnip. The little turnip didn't like being licked by a frog, so it jumped out of the ditch and started to roll out of the field and onto the lane that led down the hill to the village. The pigs in the field by the lane just stood and looked at the turnip as though it was silly beyond words as it rolled and bounced by. Bonk! Boing! All the way down the hill the turnip rolled. A boy was riding up the hill on his bike and swerved to avoid the approaching turnip. He braked, flew over the handlebars and landed head first into the hedge. The turnip kept on rolling down the hill until it reached the bottom of the lane and turned right into the village on the high street. The turnip splashed through the little duck pond in the park and splashed an elderly gentleman who was sat on a bench reading his newspaper. The elderly gentleman jumped up from the bench, shouted and shook his soggy newspaper, but the turnip was gone. The turnip rolled into the parish church and raced up and down the aisles. It skidded on the tiles and knocked over a flower display. An old woman, who was very well-to-do, started shrieking and tried to catch the turnip. The turnip was rolling too quickly for the lady to grab. It knocked over a chair, escaped underneath a pew, and bounced out into the sunshine. By the time the turnip had travelled just halfway down the street, it had dodged the feet of the postman, the milkman, and the vicar, who swiped at it with his cane. A boy kicked the turnip as it rolled past him, and it crashed into the baker's. A lady who was leaving the shop with a big cake tripped over the turnip. She landed on top of the cake, and jam, cream and sponge went everywhere, including all over her face. There were buns rolling everywhere in the confusion, and the cake stand collapsed, sending scones flying through the air. The baker was furious and took a swipe at the turnip. The turnip rolled through the shop and out into the back. It rolled under the piano, over the floor, until it skidded and landed right on top of the baker's sleeping cat. Splat! The cat woke up and its fur stood on end. It hissed and spat and chased after the turnip. Back through the shop rolled the turnip, and the baker hit it with his mop. The cat tried to scram the turnip, but it rolled out of the shop and bounced down the street. On it bounced without stopping, up and down the street, in and out of people's feet. The turnip bounced past the pub and across the road. It rolled right into a little girl who dropped the ice cream she was eating. The mother shouted and the little girl cried, but still the little turnip didn't stop. It rolled past the old, disused red telephone box, splashed through the shallow stream and out into the river beyond. That was the last anyone has seen of the turnip. Goodness knows where it is now. It might roll and bounce past you some day soon. Then, somewhere in a house nearby, a little boy spilled the ice cream he was eating for his tea all over the carpet. His mummy went mad. There it is. The end.
A pod of peas. Fresh peas, straight from the pod, are a lovely thing, especially when blended with mint and eaten in a soup on a sunny afternoon with some crusty bread. Phoebe was 9 years old and would often go with her granddad to his allotment after school. Her granddad kept a pair of Phoebe's boots at the allotment in his shed and a little wheelbarrow for her to put weeds in. Phoebe loved going to the allotment because she enjoyed being outdoors and spending time with her granddad. He would always have a little snack for her to eat, and they would sit out on deck chairs if it was sunny and laugh about this and that. One afternoon, Phoebe's granddad decided to see if the peas that he was growing were ready for podding. He picked a pod from the pea plant, which was supported by some chicken wire, snapped the stem from the pod, and pulled the spine away from end to end. Phoebe could see 4 shiny green peas inside the open pod, and her granddad removed them and placed them in her hand. She put them in her mouth and thought that the sweet, fresh flavour was the nicest thing she had ever tasted. Phoebe and her granddad then sat on their deck chairs in the sun and ate a further 10 pea pods each. She picked one more pod and put it in her coat so that she could take it home and show it to her mum. When she got home, Phoebe forgot all about the pea pod in her pocket and went straight to bed because she was so tired after helping her granddad on the allotment. The next day, Phoebe went into town on the bus to meet up with some of her friends. She wore her coat with the pea pod still in the pocket, but took it off on the bus because the weather was very warm. When the bus arrived at the bus stop at which Phoebe was to get off, she was in such a hurry to see her friends that she completely forgot her coat and left it on the bus. An elderly gentleman picked up Phoebe's coat as he left the bus and handed it to the bus driver. The bus driver went through the pockets of the coat, hoping to find a library card or something that could help him identify the owner so that the bus company could contact him or her and return the coat. The driver found a packet of chewing gum, an old bus ticket, and the pod of peas. He knew that nobody would quibble over a pod of peas, and he remembered how much he had enjoyed eating them fresh as a young boy. The driver opened the pod and looked at the 4 shiny green peas inside. He removed each pea from the pod and placed them in the palm of his left hand with the intention of eating them immediately. His mobile phone rang suddenly and startled him just as he was about to eat the peas. He dropped all 4 of them and they bounced down the steps, off the bus and onto the pavement. The first pea was immediately squished by a dog out for a walk with his owner. The dog stopped, lifted up his paw and licked the pea off it with a sloppy, wet slurp. A kid raced down the pavement on his skateboard, and the draft he created blew the second pea down a drain. It has never been seen or heard of again. A gentle summer breeze wafted the third pea off the pavement's curb and under the left front wheel of the bus. The bus pulled off and squashed the pea, carrying it on its tyre for many miles out into the countryside as a green dot of mushed pea going round and around like it was spinning in a washing machine. There was no sign of the squashed pea on the tyre by the time it returned to the depot at the end of the day. The fourth pea remained on the pavement, and after a short while found itself under a billboard outside a newsagent. A pigeon was watching the pea as it rolled gently in the breeze underneath the billboard. Just as the pigeon had made up its mind that it was going to eat the pea, a kitten appeared from nowhere and started playing with the pea. The kitten lay on the pavement, rolled over and batted the pea around with its paw. Kittens delight in anything that rolls, swings or moves, and so it spent several minutes playing with the pea. When the kitten had become bored of the game, it left in search of something more interesting to do. The pigeon had gone. The pea spent the next few hours up against the wall of the newsagents and watched the feet of the people and animals walking by. Sometimes the pea would see the wheels of a pram or of a skateboard passing by, but usually just feet or paws. The pea saw feet wearing sandals, trainers, shoes, flip-flops, and even slippers. Some feet had socks or tights on, some didn't. The pea found it more interesting to watch the feet, paws, and wheels than perhaps you or I would. As the afternoon wore on and gave way to evening, the summer breeze returned. The pea gently blew across the pavement, off the curb, and onto the road. A council street cleaning vehicle drove slowly by down the road, and the rotating brushes on the front collected all of the rubbish from the road. The pea was swept up by the brushes, sucked up a tube, and into the rear of the vehicle with the rest of the rubbish that had already been collected by the vehicle. There were lollipop sticks, crisp packets, apple cores, and all manner of things in there. As the vehicle began to fill with rubbish, the pea was slowly squished into a mushy green gunge. And that was the end of the pea. Phoebe went to collect her coat with her mum the very next day from the lost property office at the bus depot and thanked the driver for putting it aside the very next time she saw him. Phoebe had forgotten all about the pea pod and so didn't even check her pockets for it. She did check that the chewing gum was still there, though. Just then, a bird was flying but wasn't looking where it was going. It flew through an open window into Mrs. McBride's house on the lane by the church. Mrs. McBride was so startled by the flapping that she dropped her teapot on the floor. The teapot smashed and tea went everywhere. Mrs. McBride started shouting and waving her arms about. The bird flew away. What a mess! Martin's Nan always placed her dark blue teapot right in the middle of the table. His Nan had always put the teapot in the same place and reminded Martin not to touch it every time because it was hot. At 7 years old, Martin knew not to touch the teapot, but his Nan reminded him all the same. Martin loved watching the steam waft from the spout, and he enjoyed smelling the sweet, delicate fragrance of the brewing tea. It wasn't that he liked drinking tea, he didn't, but the smell reminded him of his Nan. One cold day in November, Martin had not enjoyed school. Some of the older boys liked to make fun of Martin because he was small and wore glasses. That particular morning they had kicked water from puddles at Martin's legs as he had walked through the yard on the way to his classroom. The water made Martin's trousers cold and wet, and so he started to cry. The older boys loved to see Martin cry, and so they started making fun of him even more. It took such a long time for the trousers to dry, and poor Martin sat through his first 2 lessons very cold and upset. Martin's teacher, Miss Bobkins, asked him why he was upset, but he didn't dare tell her who the boys were, in case they were even more horrible to him afterwards. As the children were leaving for morning break, Miss Bobkins called Martin back to speak to him. She told him that she knew who the boys were that had kicked water up his trousers earlier, and that they were bullying other boys too. She said that she would deal with them, and that they wouldn't bother him again. Martin was grateful to Miss Bobkins for helping him, but very worried that the boys would come after him because they would assume that he had told Miss Bobkins who they were, even though he hadn't. When Martin got home, he told his Nan about his day and the horrible boys. She told Martin not to worry, and that Miss Bobkins was a good teacher and very kind for helping him. Martin's Nan gave him a banana and a cup of milk by the fire before he went to bed, and he soon fell asleep and forgot about his horrid day. The next morning, Martin was just about to leave for school, and then he suddenly remembered that the children had been asked to take something red into school to draw in their art lesson that very morning. Martin couldn't think of anything red to take into school, and so he asked his Nan. She went into the kitchen and returned with a large, ripe, bright red tomato. Martin's Nan always said that a tomato was a lovely thing, especially when eaten with some lettuce, onion and pickle. Martin put the tomato in his lunchbox with the cheese sandwiches, an apple that he would eat at lunchtime. On his way to school that morning, Martin saw the boys who had made him cry on the previous day. The boys glared at Martin, but didn't say or do anything to him. Martin was very relieved and so grateful to Miss Bobkins, who had obviously spoken to them. Miss Bobkins was very kind, and Martin wondered what he could give her as a present. Martin had a lovely morning in school that day, and some of the other children said that his picture of the tomato was very good. Miss Bobkins said that the children had all done very well, and she chose Martin's picture, with 3 others, to be put on the wall. At the end of the lesson, as he was leaving the classroom to go for lunch, Martin gave Miss Bobkins his tomato as a present for helping him with the older boys. He explained that he had helped his Nan grow it in her greenhouse, and that it would taste very nice indeed. Miss Bobkins thanked Martin, left the tomato on her desk, and went to have her lunch with the other teachers. After lunch, Martin returned to his classroom, but the tomato was not on the desk where he had left it. Miss Bobkins had also noticed that the tomato was missing, and asked the class if anyone knew what had happened to Martin's tomato. Nobody answered, because nobody knew anything about where the tomato could have gone. Martin sat in his chair wondering where the tomato could be and who could have taken it. Perhaps the caretaker, Mr. Jenkins, had taken it by mistake and put it in the bin thinking that it would go off and start to rot. What no one in that classroom knew was that, during lunchtime, one of the older boys had crept into the room and had stolen the tomato. He had hidden it in his satchel and planned to throw it at Martin after school to make him cry. The boy, who was called Cole, was 4 years older than Martin and was angry because Miss Bobkins had rung his mum a day earlier about kicking water at Martin's trousers. After school, Cole lay in wait for Martin outside the main gates with his satchel open so that he could easily reach inside to grab the tomato and throw it. He hid the tomato in his satchel because he didn't want to be seen holding it by one of the teachers as they left school to drive home in their cars. Suddenly, 3 boys a year younger than Cole jumped on him, pinned him down, and told him that he needed to stop bullying everyone or they would go and tell the teachers. Cole struggled but couldn't get free from the boys, and as he kicked with his legs, his foot knocked the satchel aside. The contents of the satchel, including the tomato, rolled out. The tomato started to roll down the steep hill that led to the high street. It bounced over a drain and off the pavement into the road and then back onto the pavement again. Faster and faster it rolled until it came to a stop on the pavement at the bottom of the hill. The tomato came to a halt beside a mother and her young daughter Keris. They were waiting for Keris's older brother Thomas to walk down the hill from the school with his friends to meet them and then go home together. Keris was 2 years old, and she waited for her 9-year-old brother Thomas with her mother every afternoon at 3 o'clock. Not that she knew the time, as she was too young to understand clocks. Thomas would always walk down the hill, laughing with his friends, and kiss Keris on her forehead when he reached her. Keris couldn't wait until she would be big enough to go to school just like Thomas. Keris looked down to the ground, saw the tomato, picked it up from the pavement, and put it beside the doll lying inside the toy pram that she was pushing. There was no reason to pick up the tomato, but 2-year-olds don't need a reason to do anything. It always seemed to Keris and Thomas that it took ages to walk the short distance home because their mum would always stop and gossip with the other mums. The two children would pass the time by inventing a game of some sort that usually involved Thomas pulling silly faces at Keris. She would laugh and laugh at his silly faces and the voices that he would put on. This particular afternoon, Thomas had decided to pull a silly face at Keris's doll in her pram. He put his head in the pram and couldn't believe it when he saw a bright red, juicy tomato beside the doll's head. Thomas knew that their mum would not be happy with the tomato, and to save the row that would follow, he looked for a place to hide the tomato. He tried to explain the situation to Keris, but she started to cry because Thomas had taken the tomato. Quickly, and before their mum noticed, Thomas stuffed the tomato into the letterbox on the corner of their street. Thomas said that because the letterbox was red, like the tomato, everything would be all right and that the postman would send her the tomato the very next day. He hoped that Keris would forget all about it. The tomato spent all night in the letterbox alone with a load of letters and parcels. Some of them were business letters, some of them were birthday cards, and some of them were just boring old parcels with general stuff inside. In the morning, the postman came and emptied the letterbox and took the letters and parcels to the sorting office. He saw the tomato and put it in the pocket of his Royal Mail uniform. During his lunch break, the postman, who was called Terry, was eating his food with his mate Colin. Colin was eating cheese sandwiches and Terry was eating a turkey roll. Terry washed the tomato, chopped it into slices and shared it with Colin. They both enjoyed their lunch very much and were very happy that they had enjoyed such a juicy, ripe tomato with such a lovely flavour. The next morning, Martin's Nan gave him another tomato even bigger than the first one to give to Miss Bobkins. Martin gave the tomato to his teacher as soon as he arrived in the classroom. Miss Bobkins was very pleased and put the tomato in her bag. Meanwhile, a cow did a wee somewhere in a field up against a hedge. Yes, cow. A plump, juicy pumpkin is a beautiful thing, especially when chopped up and put in a soup served with cinnamon, cumin, coriander, and served at Halloween. One morning in early October, a pumpkin was growing on the soil in a field somewhere in the middle of nowhere. This pumpkin was with lots of other pumpkins. All of the pumpkins growing in the field were more or less the same size, colour, weight and shape. This particular pumpkin was large, fat and orange, as most pumpkins are, and had a little stalk shooting from the top of its head. The farmer who owned the field grew pumpkins only once a year, and just for Halloween, which falls on the last day of October. It is traditional to buy a pumpkin for Halloween each year, carve out the middle, cut scary eyes and a mouth into one side of it, and place a lit candle inside. The pumpkin is then placed in the window on Halloween when it goes dark, so that anything scary will see it and not bother the house. Later that morning, the farmer and his two lads cut the stalks of all the pumpkins from the field. It took the three of them about an hour, as there were about 100 pumpkins, and they were so very large and very heavy. All of the pumpkins were laid out in rows beside a barn on the lane. When all the pumpkins were finally cut away from their stalks, one of the lads sprayed them all with a power hose to wash the soil and dirt off. The pumpkins were then loaded onto a trailer, which was coupled to a big green tractor, and then they were driven into town to the grocer's. The pumpkin that we are following in this particular story was placed right on top of the big pile of pumpkins on the back of the trailer. As the tractor transported the pumpkins into town, the pumpkins on top of the pile had the best view, and they could see the fields and trees, rivers and houses as they drove down the lanes. A cheeky robin landed on one of the pumpkins and hitched a ride for a while, as it obviously couldn't be bothered to fly and wanted a rest. Clever robin. It began to rain lightly, and all of the pumpkins were very clean by the time they reached the town, because the rainwater had washed off all of the soil on them that the farmer's lad had missed when he had sprayed them with his hose earlier that morning. The grocer was waiting for the tractor to arrive at his shop and was very cross with the farmer, who apparently was late. The grocer called out two of his assistants to help the farmer and his lads unload the pumpkins from the trailer and put them into some very large boxes. By the time all of the pumpkins had been unloaded, there were 5 enormous boxes full of pumpkins. The farmer didn't know how the grocer expected to sell them all, but he knew that he would, because the kids from the town and surrounding villages always came to this shop to buy their pumpkins for Halloween every year. The grocer made his assistants put the boxes in various places around his shop. One box was placed outside on the pavement. Many people came into the grocer's over the next few days, people who didn't usually come into the shop, but who came in just to buy the grocer's pumpkins at Halloween. Some of the shoppers were adults on their own who were stopping off on their way home from work to buy a pumpkin for their house. Some shoppers were kids who would take ages hunting for the largest pumpkin and comparing their ideas about where to carve the eyes or how many teeth the mouths would have. However, most people who came into the grocer's to buy a pumpkin were parents with their children. By the end of the first day, 2 boxes had been completely emptied of pumpkins. By the end of the second day, all of the pumpkins in the 3rd box had been bought, and so had half of the pumpkins in the 4th and 5th box. The grocer was very pleased with how well the pumpkins had sold, and he couldn't remember a year when he had sold so many so quickly. When the shop had closed, he moved all of the pumpkins from the 4th box and put them in with the pumpkins in the 5th box. He threw the 4th box out the back with the other 3 now empty boxes for the dustbin men to come and take away the following day. The grocer knew that he would probably not have any pumpkins left by the end of the next day because it would be Halloween, and nobody ever bought a pumpkin after that. The next morning was the 31st and final day of October, Halloween. Shortly after the grocer had opened the shop, many people had come in to buy a pumpkin, and by 10 o'clock, only one was left. Our pumpkin. The pumpkin about which this story is about. So far that morning, the grocer had sold only 1 bunch of bananas, but 17 pumpkins. At 3 minutes past 10 o'clock, a little boy strolled into the grocer's with his mum. Matthew, the boy, was 6 years old, and he had made up his mind that this year his house would have the scariest pumpkin in the window to make sure no witches came to get him. Many little boys are scared of witches. Matthew's dad had been to the local supermarket and to the supermarket in the next town and the town along from that, but he had not been able to buy a single pumpkin as they all had been sold. Matthew's mum knew how disappointed he would be if a pumpkin couldn't be found, because Matthew was a good boy, and it was her fault that she hadn't thought to buy a pumpkin earlier in the week. 10 minutes before, Matthew's mum had bundled him into the back of her car and driven rather too fast to the town, parked on the high street, and dragged Matthew to the grocer's in the hope that there might still be some pumpkins unsold. As soon as Matthew and his mum entered the shop, the grocer knew what they wanted. The grocer picked up the last pumpkin out of the box and handed it to Matthew's mum, who paid for it, thanked the grocer, and was very, very relieved. She rang Matthew's dad to tell him to come home and that, thank goodness, they had found and bought a pumpkin. The grocer smiled and told Matthew what a lucky boy he was, because this was probably the last pumpkin anywhere in the county, and probably all England, that hadn't been sold by now. Matthew couldn't believe his luck, and he felt so pleased that he smiled as he travelled back to his house in the car. When Matthew arrived home, he tried to lift the pumpkin out of the boot, but he couldn't lift it because it was so heavy. Matthew's dad was already home after his wild goose chase around the supermarkets, and so he carried the pumpkin inside. Matthew's mum washed the pumpkin, even though it was already clean. She laid out some newspaper on the kitchen table and placed the pumpkin on it. Matthew traced a line around the top of the pumpkin, and his dad drew a line with a pencil where Matthew's finger had gone. Once the line was a complete circle, Matthew's dad took a carving knife, cut all the way around the pumpkin along the line and removed the top of it. Matthew looked down inside the pumpkin and couldn't believe how many seeds and strands there were. He thought it would be empty. His dad cut away many of the strands from the flesh of the pumpkin and then gave Matthew a serving spoon so that he could start hollowing it out. It took Matthew a long time to remove all of the seeds and strands, in fact, most of the morning. His arms and shoulders ached with the effort, but he was very pleased with himself. Matthew's dad removed the flesh around the inside of the pumpkin and put it in a bowl. Matthew drew 2 eyes, a small triangular nose, and a mouth with jagged teeth with a pencil. His dad cut away the flesh of the pumpkin where Matthew had drawn, and everyone was pleased with how scary the pumpkin looked. By the time all of the pumpkin preparation had finished, it was lunchtime. Matthew's mum had made a soup from the flesh of the pumpkin. Matthew and his dad enjoyed it so much that they had 2 bowls each. Later that day, when it was dark, Matthew put a candle in the pumpkin, and his mum lit it. Matthew couldn't believe how scary the pumpkin looked, and he was certain that no witches or ghouls would be bothering his house that night. The next morning, a lady and 2 gentlemen knocked on the front door of Matthew's house. They explained that they were from the local parish council. Matthew's mum knew them. Each Halloween, the parish council held a competition to see who could have the scariest pumpkin. Last night they had walked around the village looking in the windows of houses to find the scariest pumpkin, and they had all agreed that Matthew's pumpkin was the winner. They gave Matthew a book token for £10 as a prize and took a photo of him standing beside his pumpkin, which they put in the parish magazine the following month. Matthew had enjoyed Halloween so much and gave his mum and dad a long cuddle. Everyone was so pleased that Matthew's mum took them out for supper at the local pub. Just then, a postman tripped over a kitten while walking up a garden path to deliver someone's letters. He fell headfirst into a pond and a fish nibbled his ear. He was soaking and had to go home and change. Oh dear, the end. Silly Stories About Vegetables, books 1 to 3, were written by Paul Cook and read by Paul Cook. Copyright 2018 by Paul Cook.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.